Hello students, welcome back to another installment of a flipped lesson brought to you by me, Mr. Giordano. We're going to continue with what we left off on from class as we were talking about the different models of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply models. Excuse me. We're going to continue with that today. Up to this point, as you can recall, we've already discussed some of this information, and we moved on to talk about the Keynesian models of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. One of the things we left off on was, if you recall, the classical model relied on, in part, Say's law that supply creates its own demand. We touched on and finished up with last time that in the Keynesian economist's mind, it's the other way around, and demand actually creates its own supply. So we're actually looking at different models with demand side and supply side theories. We're going to move on to talk about the rest of the differences between the Keynesian model and the classical model. Obviously, the Keynesian model, this comes about, remember from class, responding to the Great Depression in the 1930s after the 1929 stock market crash in the United States. Well, this Great Depression involved more than just the United States of America, spread all throughout the world. Um, Keynesian economists also believe that government should step in to get involved in the economy. It's not going to, the ship is not going to right itself. It needs a little bit of help to do that. Keynes felt that the economy is in a recession, or if it's depressed, that the government needs to do something in terms of an expansionary policy in order to get the economy back up on its feet and get it to full employment. We're going to look more in detail in classes what we mean by expansionary fiscal policies and or expansionary monetary policies. Fiscal policies mainly dealing with government raising and lowering taxes and raising and lowering spending, and monetary policy obviously dealing with at least in the United States, the Federal Reserve's function as a monetary advisor and stimulator in the economy. We're going to get in more detail later on that. As you can see in the Keynesian ranges, when we are in a depressed situation in the first two models, you can look at aggregate demand as not at full employment. If these expansionary policies are put into effect, we can move our aggregate demand curve closer to getting to full employment. Also, there's this idea of sticky wages and sticky prices. This is a sticky situation. That was a joke. Um, when we're looking at classical economic thought, these classical economists believed that wages and prices were flexible. Keynes believed that wages and prices remain sticky in the short run. And this is something that you can go in a little further and talking about why that is. We may touch on this a little bit more in more detail in class. You can always go to the link and get a little bit more information ahead of time to flexible wages and prices on your own. But again, this is something that is different between the two models. Number 4 is in the Keynesian model, how it differs is that savings and consumption are a function of income. Classical thought basically stated that savings was a function of interest rates, whereas Keynes believed that savings and consumption are a function of income. Okay, so what do we do with these? Which one of these is the best model to use? Well, just like any economist would answer any question in economics, you could answer it. It really does depend. Each one of these models does have its own benefits. We'll look at the intricacies of each. Models 1 and 2 have 3 different ranges. Remember, this is different than the classical model. It has the Keynesian range, it has the intermediate range, and it also has the classical range. And you can see that in those labeled areas that lit up in these. Both aggregate supply curves in these two graphs relate directly back to the production possibilities curve. And remember, the production possibilities curve we discussed way back at the beginning of the course. This may be a little bit of a refresher for you from what we did in introductory economics and microeconomics. It also applies in macroeconomics, so it's probably a good thing that we hit this again. But there's a direct relationship between the aggregate supply curve for both of these models, in these Keynesian models, and the production possibilities frontier. When you think about it, um, we were talking about the different parts of the production possibilities curve. Remember, you could produce anywhere along this curve. You could produce all of this good and none of the other. You could produce all of this good on this axis and none of the other. We also talked about the points along the curve are all possible and are all maxing out the economy, while everything inside is possible and inefficient, and everything outside of the PPC or PPF is not possible at the current time. And when production is inefficient, you could see the dot here. I was just talking about an entity is operating at a point inside of this PPC. We'll label this K on this graph. This actually represents the part of the curve that is related directly to the Keynesian range on the aggregate supply curve. So this point K, again, relates to the Keynesian part where we are not efficient. We're producing, but we're inside of our production possibilities curve. As we get closer to our capability, our production possibility, our frontier, if you will, and resources get scarcer, it forces upward pressure on prices and gets us to a point where we're getting closer and closer to this curve. We'll label this point I on the PPF. Point I is just inside the PPC. This relates directly to the intermediate range of the aggregate supply curve. We're going to keep going as economy continues to grow, it gets to full capacity, it becomes a point on the curve. It's using its resources. Everything is efficient. It's operating somewhere along this curve. We'll call this point C. C relates to the classical range on the aggregate supply curve. So you could actually see the direct relationship between the production possibilities curve and the aggregate supply curve for a macroeconomy in the Keynesian range, in the Keynesian models, excuse me. Models 1 and 2 are identical in the Keynesian and classical ranges, but differ in the slope of the intermediate range. You can see the difference between the two. The intermediate range in the first model slopes upward, where we're talking about a gradual rise in prices when output increases. This is probably a better indicator of what happens in the economy than the slope of the intermediate range in the second model. You can see in Model 2, it's much more distinct, making it easier to distinguish where each range begins and ends. Okay. We also look at Model 3, the new classical model of a aggregate supply and demand model. Notice in this one that the aggregate supply curve is not broken up into stages, but it has a short run and a long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Short run aggregate supply is the upward sloping. Then we have a long run aggregate supply is this perfectly inelastic curve at full employment. You can now see how Model 2 and 3 are actually very similar. If we overlap the two in a moment, you're going to see how similar they really are. But let's change them all to two different colors. You can see the difference between the two. Model 2 will be all red. Model 3 will be all blue. And let's see what they look like when we superimpose the two. What do you notice about these two? Is there anything similar? Is there anything different? You notice, in this case, that there is no Keynesian range on the blue model, okay, as there is on the red model, okay. We also notice the similarity in the two is this section that we call the intermediate range for both of these models. In Model 3, it stretches beyond full employment, YF. Then we could put these two back to show you the difference between the two and look at them separately. Again, there's no Keynesian range in Model 3. Notice the short run aggregate supply curve in Model 3 is the intermediate range in Model 2. Intermediate range in Model 2, though, does not stretch out as far as the short run aggregate supply curve. You'll see this change this to a blue dotted line so you can see a little better. If we change the aggregate supply on the top of the classical range in Model 2 to LRAS to represent the long-run aggregate supply curve in Model 3, you can see the similarities in the two models. Go back a second so you can see that. Long-run aggregate supply in both. So what do we use? The question is. Again, it depends. Each one of these models is accurate. Each one of them has their own advantages and has their own disadvantages. It will explain the same scenario in its own unique and special way. When we're talking about aggregate supply and aggregate demand, if you graph any of these out, as long as you label the axes correctly, as long as you understand the reasoning behind the creation of the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves, and the factors that can change either one of these, you should be good to go on the AP exam. All right, today this finishes our discussion then of the different models of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Just a quick recap, we've talked about Model 1 and Model 2 as the Keynesian models of aggregate supply and demand. Model 3 is the new classical model of aggregate supply and demand, and the differences between classical and Keynesian thought, and why they are different from each other. I hope you enjoyed this installment. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. And if you would like to, you can peruse the different sections of the website Refonomics. You'll find this and many other helpful pieces of information. Again, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in class next time.